The first time I heard about the wards, I was sitting in a diner in Asheville, drinking coffee that tasted like creek water and listening to two old-timers argue about whether the lumber mill would reopen. This was 1952, 36 years after everything happened, and these men were old enough to remember. One of them, a guy named Pruitt with hands like leather mitts, suddenly went quiet when his friend mentioned buying some land up near Cutter's Gap. "Not the Ward place," Pruitt said, and the way he said it made my spine straighten. "Hell no," his friend replied. "Nobody touches that land." I should have left it alone. I was just passing through, researching Appalachian folk traditions for a book that would never get published. But I've always had a problem with leaving things alone, especially when people get that particular look on their faces, like they're remembering something they've spent decades trying to forget. What I found out over the next 3 months, piecing together fragments from people who mostly refused to talk, was a story that makes me question everything I thought I understood about human nature and what people are capable of when they're desperate, isolated, and convinced they're doing the right thing. The wards weren't monster. That's the thing that keeps me up at night. They were ordinary people who made one terrible choice, then another, until they'd built something so grotesque that the whole town had to collectively decide it never happened. Let me tell you what they refused to say. In the spring of 1916, Cutter's Gap was barely a town. Maybe 200 people spread across the hollows, most of them related by blood or marriage, all of them poor in a way that's hard to explain to people who've never gone to bed hungry more nights than not. The lumber companies had stripped most of the good timber. The soil was tired. The young men were starting to drift away to the textile mills in the Piedmont or the coal mines in West Virginia. The Ward family lived about 3 miles up a logging road that had mostly grown over. Marcus Ward, his wife Loretta, and their 4 children: Samuel, who was 19, Mary, 17, Thomas, 14, and little Anne, who was 8. By all accounts, they were well liked. Marcus had a reputation as an honest man, which in those hills meant more than being wealthy or educated. He could fix just about anything mechanical, and people would bring him broken equipment from miles around. Loretta made preserves that won ribbons at the county fair the 3 times she'd bothered to enter. They were religious, but not crazy about it. Methodist, church-going, the kind of people who actually tried to live by what the Bible said, rather than just using it to beat others over the head. Samuel was engaged to a girl named Ruth Compton, daughter of one of the more prosperous families in the area. The wedding was planned for June. This is important because what happened wasn't the result of the Wards being evil or insane or corrupted by some outside force. They were normal. Good, even. And that's the thing that should terrify you, because it means the capacity for what they did exists in all of us, given the right circumstances. The first sign that something was wrong came in late April, when Samuel didn't show up to help Ruth's father build a new chicken coop. Ruth walked up to the Ward place to check on him, and Loretta met her at the door with an expression Ruth later described as like she was holding herself together with wire and prayer. "Samuel's poorly," Loretta said. "Best you don't come in. Might be catching." Ruth wasn't an idiot. She'd been around sick people her whole life. She could hear Samuel coughing from inside the house, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of serious lung trouble. "Has the doctor seen him?" "Doctor's got his hands full," Loretta said, which was true enough. There had been an outbreak of measles down in the lower valley, and old Doc Hensley was running himself ragged trying to keep it from spreading. We're managing fine. But they weren't managing fine. That was clear to anyone who saw Loretta over the next few weeks. She got thinner, more haggard, her eyes taking on a feverish brightness that people associated with either religious mania or the early stages of consumption. Marcus stopped coming down to the general store for supplies. When someone asked after them at church, Thomas would just say they were all working hard on the spring planting and let the subject drop. Here's what I think happened, based on what I could piece together. Samuel got sick with what was probably tuberculosis, common enough in those days. But instead of just Samuel, the whole family got it. Marcus, Loretta, Mary, Thomas. Only little Ann seemed to be spared, at least at first. Now, tuberculosis was a death sentence for a lot of people back then, but it wasn't automatic. Some people recovered, especially if they got rest, good food, fresh air. But the wards didn't have the money for a sanatorium, and they couldn't afford to stop working even if they were sick. More than that, there was a stigma. Families with TB were isolated, avoided. Samuel's engagement to Ruth would have been broken off immediately. The family's reputation would have been destroyed. So they made the decision that would damn them. They hid it. They stopped going to church, stopped taking visitors. When people came by, whoever was feeling strongest that day would come out, make excuses, send them away. They kept working their land as much as they could, but neighbors started noticing the fields weren't being tended properly. The fence lines were falling apart. The house started to look shabby. By June, when Samuel and Ruth should have been married, the wards had become almost invisible. A few people expressed concern, but this was 1916 in the mountains. People minded their own business. If a family wanted to keep to themselves, that was their right. What no one knew was that Samuel had died in late May, and the wards couldn't tell anyone. This is where I have to stop and talk about something that modern people don't really understand: how isolated these communities were, and how that isolation created its own logic, its own morality, that can seem incomprehensible from the outside. If the wards had reported Samuel's death, questions would have been asked. The doctor would have come. He would have seen that the whole family was sick. Word would have spread. Ruth's family would have been mortified that she'd been engaged to a man dying of consumption, would have wondered if she'd been exposed. The wards would have been blamed for endangering the whole community by not reporting the disease earlier. And here's the crucial part. The county would have taken Anne away. There were laws about this. Children couldn't be left in houses with active tuberculosis. She would have been sent to an orphanage or placed with another family, and the wards would probably never have gotten her back. And their minds, weakened by disease and fear and isolation, this became the one unacceptable outcome. They could endure sickness, poverty, even death, but they couldn't let the authorities take their youngest child. So they buried Samuel in the woods behind their house in an unmarked grave and told no one. And then things got worse. Thomas died in July, Mary in August. By September, it was just Marcus, Loretta, and Anne, and Marcus and Loretta were both obviously dying. But Anne was still healthy. By some miracle or curse, the 8-year-old had never developed symptoms. She was stuck in a house with her dying parents, 2 dead siblings buried in the woods, and no way to ask for help without destroying what little was left of her family's name and ensuring she'd be taken away. The question that haunted me as I researched this was, what did they tell her? How did they explain to an 8-year-old child why her siblings had disappeared? Why her parents were coughing blood? Why she couldn't leave the house or talk to anyone? I found part of the answer in a journal entry from Jeremiah Saunders, a circuit preacher who passed through the area in October of 1916. He wrote about stopping at the Ward place, hoping to check on a family he'd heard was struggling. No one answered my knock, he wrote, but I heard a child singing inside, a hymn, though she had the words wrong. She sang, "Jesus loves me when I'm good, when I'm quiet like I should, when I help my mama sleep, when I don't cry and don't weep." Over and over, that strange verse. I called out, asking if all was well. The singing stopped immediately. I heard running footsteps, a door slamming. Then silence. Something in that silence troubled me more than any cry for help, but the door remained shut, and I had no cause to force entry into a family's home. I left a basket of food on the porch and rode on. May God forgive me. That entry made me sick when I read it. Still does. That little girl, alone with dying parents, had been taught to be good, to be quiet, to help her mama sleep. What did that mean? Was she bringing Loretta water, cleaning up blood, sitting with her father as he wasted away? Here's what I learned from a woman named Edith Marsh, who was 93 when I interviewed her in 1952, and who had been Ann Ward's schoolteacher before the family withdrew from town. Ann was the sweetest child, Edith told me, her hands shaking as she held a cup of tea. Smart as a whip, always helping the younger children with their letters. When she stopped coming to school in May, I thought maybe the family had moved, though that didn't make sense with planting season. I asked around, but people just shrugged. Families pulled their kids from school all the time to work. In November, I was visiting a family up near Cutter's Gap, and I saw Ann walking on the road, just walking in the middle of the day, wearing a dress that was too thin for the cold. I called to her, asked where she was going. She looked at me with these empty eyes and said, "I'm looking for someone to tell." I asked her what she needed to tell. She opened her mouth, and I swear to God no sound came out. She just stood there, mouth open, tears running down her face, making no sound at all. I thought maybe she'd gone mute from shock or illness. I tried to approach her, but she ran off into the woods. I followed for a bit, but she moved like a deer, like she knew every inch of those hills. I lost her. I should have done more. I should have gotten the sheriff, forced someone to check on that family. But I told myself I was being foolish, that I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. And then winter came, and I got busy with my own problems, and I let it slip away. Edith was crying by the time she finished telling me this. She'd lived 36 years with the guilt, and it had carved her hollow. Winter that year came early and hard. By December, the Ward house was dark most nights. No smoke from the chimney. No signs of life. People noticed, but no one did anything. This is the part that made me angriest when I researched this story. The part that made me want to shake those old-timers and scream at them for their cowardice. But that's not fair, and I know it. The thing about small communities is that they run on a delicate balance of mutual obligation and mutual respect for privacy. You help your neighbors, but you don't intrude. You offer assistance, but you don't force it on people who haven't asked. The wards had made it clear they wanted to be left alone, and in those hills, you respected that. Besides, these were hard times for everyone. People were focused on their own survival. If the wards wanted to struggle through whatever troubles they had without help, that was their choice. Except it wasn't just the adults making that choice anymore. Marcus died in December, probably around the middle of the month. Loretta lasted until early January. And then it was just Anne, alone in a house with 4 corpses in the dead of an Appalachian winter. She was 9 years old. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she walk to the nearest neighbor, tell them what had happened, get help? Because her parents had taught her, with the best intentions and the most desperate love, that she had to keep the secret. That if anyone found out about the sickness, bad people would come and take her away. That she had to be good, be quiet, take care of the house, wait until everything got better. Children believe what their parents tell them, especially when they're terrified and have no framework for understanding what's happening. So Anne stayed. She lived on the food that was left in the house, on the preserves her mother had made, on whatever she could scavenge. She kept a fire going in the hearth when she could gather wood, and she waited for her parents to get better, because that's what they told her would happen. If she was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough. The first person to discover the truth was Clayton Booker, a hunter who was tracking a wounded deer through the woods in February. He followed the blood trail almost to the ward property, then noticed something that stopped him cold. A row of 4 crosses made from tree branches, tied together with what looked like strips of fabric. They were stuck in the ground at the edge of the tree line behind the ward house. Clayton was no fool. He knew what graves looked like, even crude ones. He approached the house carefully, expecting to find it abandoned. Instead, he saw smoke coming from the chimney and a small face watching him from the window. When Anne saw him, she disappeared into the house. Clayton knocked on the door, called out that he meant no harm. No answer. He tried the door, found it barred from the inside. "Little girl," he called, "are your folks home? Is everything all right?" A long pause, then a small voice. "Mama said not to talk to strangers. Where's your mama, sweetheart?" Another pause, then, "Upstairs, sleeping." Something about the way she said "sleeping" made Clayton's blood run cold. He asked a few more questions, got no useful answers, and finally told Anne he was going to get help. She begged him not to, started crying, said she'd been good, she'd been quiet. Please don't let the bad people come. Clayton rode hard to town and found the sheriff, a man named Earl Hoskins, who'd held the position for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything. They gathered a few men and rode back to the ward place as the sun was setting. What they found is a matter of public record, though you'd never know it from how people in the area talk about it. The official report is filed away in the county archives, and I had to get special permission to read it. The clerk who pulled it out for me looked like I'd asked her to dig up a corpse, which, in a way, I had. Anne had barred the door with a piece of furniture she'd somehow managed to drag across the floor. When the men broke in, they found the downstairs relatively neat. Firewood stacked by the hearth, dishes washed and put away, a child's attempt at keeping house. Upstairs was different. Marcus and Loretta were in their bed, side by side, their bodies in advanced stages of decomposition. Someone had covered them with a quilt and placed wildflowers on their chests, flowers that had long since dried to brittle husks. The window was open, despite the cold, probably Anne's attempt to deal with the smell. In the room that had belonged to Samuel and Thomas, they found 2 more bodies on the beds, similarly arranged. Mary was in her own small room, laid out with a rag doll tucked into her arms. Anne had been living in this house with 5 corpses for at least 2 months, probably longer. The men who discovered this scene were tough people, used to death and hardship. But this broke them in ways they couldn't articulate. Several of them started crying. One ran outside and vomited. Sheriff Hoskins, who wrote the report, noted that his hands were shaking too badly to write properly for several minutes. They found Anne hiding in the root cellar. She was severely malnourished, suffering from frostbite on her fingers and toes, and initially mute with terror. When Sheriff Hoskins finally coaxed her out and wrapped her in a blanket, she kept repeating the same thing over and over. "I was good. I was quiet. I helped Mama sleep." The sheriff asked her how long her mother had been sleeping. "A long time," Anne whispered. "But she'll wake up when spring comes. She promised." That detail appears in Hoskins's report, and it's the part that still brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. This little girl had spent months caring for corpses, believing they were just sleeping, waiting for the spring thaw to bring them back to life. Because her parents, in their desperation to keep her from being afraid, had told her they were just very sick, that they needed to sleep, that she needed to be good and quiet, and everything would be fine. Now here's where the story gets complicated, and where you start to understand why the town refused to talk about it. Anne was taken to Doc Hensley's house, where the doc's wife, Martha, nursed her back to physical health. The frostbite cost her parts of 3 fingers, but she survived. Physically, at least. Mentally, she was shattered in ways that the people of 1916 had no framework for understanding. She barely spoke. She had nightmares that made her scream for hours. She couldn't stand to be in closed rooms. The smell of flowers made her hysterical, and she kept insisting that her parents were just sleeping, that they'd wake up soon, that she needed to go home and take care of them. The county wanted to send her to an orphanage in Asheville, or possibly to a state institution for disturbed children. But Ruth Compton, Samuel's former fiancée, stepped forward and said she'd take Anne in. Ruth was only 23, unmarried, and living with her aging parents. She had no legal claim on the child and no particular reason to take on such a burden, but she did it anyway. "I was supposed to marry into that family," Ruth told the sheriff. "That makes Anne my responsibility." Here's where I have to give Ruth Compton credit. She spent 3 years patiently, lovingly bringing Anne back from the edge of madness. She never lied to the girl about what had happened, but she also didn't force her to confront it before she was ready. She let Anne set the pace of her own healing. But the town didn't make it easy, because while all this was happening, people were asking questions. How had an entire family died without anyone noticing? Why hadn't the neighbors checked on them? Why hadn't the church intervened? Why hadn't the teacher followed up when Anne stopped coming to school? The answer, of course, was that everyone had failed. Not through malice, but through the same mixture of respect for privacy, assumption that others were handling it, and focus on their own problems that allows tragedies to unfold in plain sight. But people don't like to think of themselves as complicit in the death of children, so they did what communities always do when confronted with collective guilt. They found a way to make it not their fault. The story that spread through Cutter's Gap and the surrounding area went like this. The Wards had been strange people, always secretive, always standoffish. They'd deliberately hidden their illness out of pride or stubbornness or religious mania. They'd essentially imprisoned their own daughter, forcing her to stay in a house of death rather than seek help. The whole thing was a tragedy, yes, but it was the Ward's own doing. No one could have known. No one could have helped, even if they'd tried. This narrative was comforting because it meant no one had to examine their own inaction. But it required erasing certain facts: that the Wards had been well liked before they got sick, that they'd been active in the community, that their withdrawal had been gradual and not particularly unusual for a struggling farm family. And it required making Anne complicit in her own imprisonment. The whispers started about 6 months after Anne came to live with Ruth. People began saying that there was something wrong with the girl, something unnatural. She'd lived with the dead for months and hadn't gone completely insane, which surely meant she wasn't quite right to begin with. When she started to recover, started speaking again and showing signs of normal childhood behavior, this was somehow seen as evidence of her strangeness rather than her resilience. Normal children wouldn't bounce back from something like that, people said. The fact that she could laugh again, play again, meant she must not have normal feelings. There was talk about whether she should be allowed to attend school with other children. Some parents worried she might be tainted somehow, that she might upset their own kids with stories about living with corpses. Never mind that Anne never talked about what had happened, that she kept those months locked away in a place where no one could reach them. The more people talked, the more the story mutated. By the time a year had passed, you could hear people in town claiming that Anne had killed her own family, or that the whole family had been devil worshippers, or that the house was cursed. The truth, which was simply that poverty and disease and isolation had combined to create an impossible situation, was less satisfying than a story with clear villains and supernatural explanations. Ruth fought back the only way she could, by living her life openly, taking Anne everywhere with her, showing the town that this was just a normal little girl who'd survived something horrible. She enrolled Anne in school despite the complaints. She brought her to church. She let her play with other children. And slowly, grudgingly, most people accepted it. Anne became a familiar sight in town, a quiet girl who preferred books to people but was perfectly polite when spoken to. She helped Ruth's mother with the cooking. She did well in her studies. She seemed, by all outward appearances, to be healing. But the Ward place stood empty. No one would buy the land. No one would even salvage the lumber from the house. The 4 graves in the woods remained unmarked, except for those crude crosses that rotted and fell apart over the years. And no one, absolutely no one, wanted to talk about what had happened there. This is what made me angriest about the whole thing: the town's determination to forget. Not just to move on, which would have been understandable, but to actively suppress any discussion of the tragedy. When I started asking questions in 1952, people would physically leave rooms rather than talk about it. They'd tell me to let the dead rest. They'd say it was disrespectful to bring up such old pain. But that wasn't why they refused to talk. They refused because remembering the wards meant remembering their own failure to help, their own choice to look away. Anne grew up. She was 14 when Ruth married a decent man named Paul Hendricks, who treated Anne like his own daughter. She was 17 when she finished high school, one of the few girls in the area to do so. She was bright enough to go to college, but there was no money for it. And besides, where would a girl from the mountains go? She worked at the general store for a few years. She was engaged briefly to a young man from the next county over, but it fell apart for reasons no one would explain to me. She seemed to be building a normal life, or as normal as possible for someone with her history. And then, in 1929, when Anne was 21 years old, she walked into the woods and didn't come back. They found her 3 days later, hanging from a tree about half a mile from the old Ward place. She'd left a note pinned to her dress. It said, "I tried to be good. I tried to be quiet. I helped Mama sleep, but she never woke up, and neither will I." The town buried her quickly and quietly in the far corner of the churchyard where the ground was rocky and no one would have to walk past her grave regularly. Her death was ruled a suicide, which meant she couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, according to church law. But the preacher bent the rules because he said Anne had suffered enough. Ruth Compton Hendricks collapsed at the funeral and had to be carried out. People said she was never quite right after that losing Anne broke something in her that never healed. She and Paul had 3 children of their own, but she always kept Anne's room in the house exactly as the girl had left it, like she was expected back any day. And still, no one wanted to talk about the wards. I need to stop here and address something, because I can hear the questions forming in your mind. Why are you telling this story? What gives you the right? Isn't this exactly the kind of dredging up of old pain that you just criticized the town for wanting to avoid? Fair questions. Here's my answer. There's a difference between forgetting and refusing to learn. The town of Cutter's Gap wanted to forget the wards because remembering was painful and inconvenient. But in refusing to remember, they ensured that the lessons of the tragedy were never learned, the patterns never broken. Because here's what I discovered as I researched this story. It wasn't unique. In the county records, if you dig deep enough and know what to look for, you can find echoes of the Ward tragedy scattered across decades. Different families, different specifics, but the same basic pattern: isolation, illness, pride, fear, and a community that noticed something was wrong but didn't intervene until it was too late. There was the Hutchins family in 1923, where a widowed father and his 3 children died of influenza in their cabin, undiscovered for weeks. There was the Prather case in 1931, where a mother with untreated mental illness was left alone with her children because the family didn't want the shame of having her institutionalized. There were probably others that never even made it into the records. The pattern persists because no one wants to examine the underlying causes. The grinding poverty that makes people too proud to ask for help. The isolation that makes it easy to lose track of struggling neighbors. The stigma around illness and mental health that forces people to hide their problems, and the community habit of minding your own business, even when doing so, enables tragedy. These aren't problems unique to 1916 or to the Appalachian Mountains. They're human problems, and they persist because we'd rather forget individual tragedies than confront the systemic issues that enable them. So I'm telling this story not to shame the dead or satisfy morbid curiosity, but because Anne Ward deserves to be remembered as more than a whispered warning or a ghost story. She deserves to have her suffering acknowledged, her resilience honored, and her death understood as the final, inevitable consequence of a community's collective failure. And because the conditions that killed her family and eventually killed her still exist in different forms, in different places. People still hide illness because they can't afford treatment or fear stigma. Children still suffer in silence because they've been taught not to make trouble. Communities still look away from obvious signs of trouble because intervention is uncomfortable and inconvenient. Let me tell you about the last piece of this story, the part that made me understand why the silence around the wards ran so deep. In 1947, 18 years after Anne's suicide, a fire destroyed half the records room in the county courthouse. Accidental, they said, faulty wiring. But the records that survived were carefully preserved, and the records that were lost, well, it's interesting what disappeared. The complete autopsy reports on the Ward family, gone. The full report from Sheriff Hoskins about the condition of the house and Anne's state when found, gone. The county health department's investigation into why the tuberculosis outbreak wasn't reported, gone. Several pages from the school attendance records for 1916, gone. What survived were just the basics. Death certificates with minimal information, a bare-bones property transfer document when the Ward land was eventually sold to the county for taxes, and a short article from the local paper that mentioned the deaths in the most cursory way possible. When I interviewed the courthouse clerk about this in 1952, she was in her 60s and had worked there since 1920. She got very quiet when I asked about the missing records, then finally said, "Some things are better left in the past. That fire cleaned out a lot of painful memories." I asked her if she thought the fire was really an accident. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Does it matter? Those records weren't helping anyone. They were just keeping old wounds open." That's when I understood. The town hadn't just passively forgotten the wards. They'd actively erased them, carefully and deliberately removing evidence of what happened so that future generations wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. And it almost worked. By 1952, most people under 40 had never heard of the wards. The family had been successfully erased from the collective memory, reduced to a vague story about something bad that happened a long time ago. But you can't really erase something like that. It leaves traces. The Ward property sat empty for decades. The county owned it, but couldn't sell it. A few times over the years, developers or lumber companies expressed interest, but the deals always fell through for vague reasons. The house collapsed in the 1930s, leaving just a stone chimney and a foundation filled with brambles. Local kids would dare each other to go up there at night, the way kids always do with places that have bad reputations. Most of them reported nothing unusual, just a creepy abandoned homestead in the woods. But some of them came back with stories. They said they heard singing, a child's voice, getting the words to hymns wrong. They said they saw lights in the windows of a house that no longer had walls. They said they found fresh wildflowers on the graves, which should have been impossible because no one knew exactly where the graves were anymore. Ghost stories, obviously. the kind that spring up around any place with a tragic history. I don't believe in the supernatural, and I don't think the Ward place is actually haunted by Anne's spirit or the restless souls of her family. But I do think places can hold memories, encoded in the landscape and the stories people tell. And I think the Ward place holds the memory of a family that was failed by their community, and a girl who was failed twice. Once when she was left to suffer alone, and again when she was erased from history to soothe the guilty consciences of those who survived. Here's what I think actually happened, piecing together all the evidence I could gather. The Wards were a normal, loving family who contracted tuberculosis, probably from Marcus, who may have been exposed while repairing equipment at the lumber mill. They were already struggling financially, and the illness made everything worse. When Samuel got sick, they initially planned to seek help, but the stigma and fear of losing Anne stopped them. By the time they realized how serious things were, it was too late. Samuel died, and they were trapped. If they reported his death now, all the questions would come. Why hadn't they sought help earlier? Why hadn't they reported a contagious disease? They convinced themselves they could weather it, that the others would recover, that they just needed time. But tuberculosis doesn't work that way. Thomas died, then Mary. Marcus and Loretta, both sick themselves, were faced with an impossible choice: report the deaths and lose Anne, or keep hiding and hope they'd survive long enough to see her grown. They chose to hide, and they made Anne complicit in that hiding, not through cruelty, but through love. They couldn't bear to leave her alone in the world, so they convinced her, and maybe convinced themselves, that this was temporary, that they'd all be fine if they just held on a little longer. When Marcus and Loretta died, Anne was left alone with instructions to be good, be quiet, wait for spring, don't tell anyone. She followed those instructions because she was a child, and children obey their parents, even when those parents are beyond the grave. The fact that she survived at all is remarkable. The fact that she recovered enough to function in society is a testament to Ruth Compton's patience and love. But the trauma never really left her. She carried it inside like a stone, heavy and cold, until finally the weight of it pulled her down. Her suicide wasn't inevitable. With proper support, with therapy that didn't exist in those days, with a community that acknowledged rather than erased what she'd been through, she might have survived. But instead, she was treated as an embarrassment, a reminder of collective guilt, something to be managed and minimized and eventually forgotten. When she killed herself, she did it in the woods near her family's old home. That detail is important. She went back to the place where everything fell apart, the place she'd spent years being told to forget about. She went back because that was the only place where her suffering was real, where it couldn't be denied or minimized or erased. And even then, even in death, the town tried to make her invisible. Quick burial, far corner of the graveyard. No headstone for years until Ruth finally had one made. I visited Anne's grave in October of 1952. It's a small stone, simple, just her name and dates. Anne Ward, 1908-1929. Ruth had chosen not to add beloved daughter or any other epitaph. Just the facts, the bare minimum. But someone had left flowers, fresh ones, not more than a day old. The caretaker told me Ruth came every week, had done so for 23 years. Even though Ruth was in her 60s by then, in poor health, she made the trip to the cemetery every single week and left flowers on Anne's grave. Never misses, the caretaker said. Rain, snow, don't matter. She's here every Sunday morning before church. I asked if anyone else ever visited. He shook his head. Just Mrs. Hendricks. Far as I know, no one else even remembers the girl was here. That conversation is what made me decide to write this all down, because Ruth Compton Hendricks was keeping the memory alive alone, and when she died, there would be no one left who remembered Ann Ward as a real person, rather than a cautionary tale or a ghost story. I went back to see Ruth one more time before I left the area. She was sitting on her porch, looking older than her years, worn down by decades of carrying grief that no one else would acknowledge. I told her what I'd learned, what I was planning to write. I asked her if she thought I was doing the right thing. She was quiet for a long time, just rocking in her chair, looking out at the mountains. Finally, she said, "People want to forget. They think forgetting is the same as healing, but it's not. Forgetting is just running away from the wound until it goes septic." Anne couldn't forget. She tried. Lord knows she tried. But those months in that house marked her in ways that couldn't be erased. And every time someone in town looked away from her, every time they changed the subject when the Wards were mentioned, every time they acted like that whole family had never existed, it told her that her suffering didn't matter. So, you write your story. You tell people what happened. Not because it'll change anything for Anne, God rest her, but because maybe somewhere, someone will read it and realize they need to check on their neighbor. They need to ask the uncomfortable questions. They need to intervene even when it's awkward and difficult and none of their business. Because that's what would have saved the Wards. Not money, not medicine, though those would have helped. Just someone being willing to push past. They want to be left alone and actually make sure they were all right. Ruth died in 1955, 3 years after I spoke with her. She'd outlived her husband and 2 of her 3 children. At her funeral, the preacher talked about her kindness and her faith and her devotion to her family. He didn't mention Ann Ward, but I noticed that Ruth was buried next to Ann, in that far corner of the graveyard. She'd bought the plot years earlier, making sure that in death, at least, Ann wouldn't be alone. So what's the moral of this story? What are we supposed to learn from the Ward family tragedy? I've spent years thinking about this, and I don't have a neat answer. The easy lesson would be something like, check on your neighbors, or don't let pride keep you from asking for help. And those are valid lessons, as far as they go. But I think the real lesson is more uncomfortable. Communities are capable of remarkable cruelty, not through active malice, but through passive neglect and the desire for comfort over truth. The people of Cutter's Gap weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, good people in many ways, who made a series of small, understandable choices that added up to catastrophe. They respected the Ward's privacy. They assumed someone else was handling it. They had their own problems to deal with. They didn't want to intrude. And after the tragedy, they made another series of small, understandable choices. They protected themselves from guilt by rewriting the narrative, by erasing the evidence, by refusing to speak about it, by making the victims into villains or ghosts, or simply making them disappear. This is how communities protect themselves from collective guilt, not through conspiracy or malice, but through 1,000 small acts of forgetting and denial that add up to erasure. The Ward family died. Anne Ward suffered and eventually killed herself, and the town that could have prevented all of it continued on, convinced of its own innocence, until the story became a whisper and then a silence, and then nothing at all. Except it wasn't nothing, because in that silence, in that refusal to remember and learn, the conditions that enabled the tragedy persisted. Other families suffered in isolation. Other children were taught to hide their pain. Other communities looked away from obvious signs of trouble. The cycle continues because we prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. I never published the book I was researching in 1952. I tried to write it several times, but I couldn't find the right approach. How do you tell a story like this without either exploiting the suffering or minimizing it? How do you honor the dead while also holding the living accountable? Eventually, I gave up and moved on to other projects. But I kept my notes, kept the interviews I'd recorded, kept the few documents I'd managed to copy before they disappeared. And now, in 1969, I'm an old man myself, and I'm watching the world change in ways that both give me hope and fill me with despair. Young people are questioning authority, demanding transparency, refusing to accept comfortable lies. But at the same time, I see the same patterns of neglect and denial playing out in different contexts. So I'm finally writing this down, not as a book, but as a record. Because Anne Ward deserves to be remembered. Her family deserves to have their story told honestly, without the sanitizing that the town imposed on it. They were people, flawed, frightened, doing their best in impossible circumstances. They made terrible choices, but those choices were enabled and exacerbated by a community that valued comfort and privacy over intervention and care. And Anne was a child who survived the unsurvivable, who fought her way back from madness and trauma, who tried to build a normal life despite carrying a weight that no one should have to carry. She deserved better than she got. She deserved a community that acknowledged her suffering rather than trying to erase it. The town refused to say what happened to the Ward family because saying it out loud would mean accepting responsibility. But silence isn't innocence. Forgetting isn't healing. And erasing the past doesn't prevent it from repeating. So here it is, the thing the town refused to say. The Ward family died because they were poor, sick, and afraid, and because the community that could have helped them chose not to see their suffering until it was too late. Anne Ward survived that nightmare, only to be crushed by the weight of collective guilt and denial. And everyone who could have prevented it chose comfort over courage, silence over truth. That's what the town refused to say about the Ward family. And that refusal, that silence, killed Anne, just as surely as the rope she hanged herself with. I went back to Cutter's Gap one last time in the spring of 1968. The town had changed. Interstate highways had made it less isolated. Television had brought the outside world in. The young people were leaving for cities and colleges. The old ways were dying out. But the Ward place was still empty, still undeveloped, still avoided. I hiked up there, following the overgrown logging road, 52 years after everything happened. The chimney still stood, though it was crumbling. The foundation was barely visible under decades of accumulated vegetation. The graves were completely lost, markers long since rotted away. But the land remembered. There was a quality to the silence there, a weight to the air that spoke of suffering unacknowledged and stories untold. I stood in what had been the Ward family's front yard and tried to imagine them as they were before everything fell apart. Marcus fixing a piece of machinery, Loretta hanging laundry, the children playing or working or studying. A normal family, neither better nor worse than any other, just trying to survive in a hard place during hard times. They should have made it. With a little help, a little intervention, a little willingness from their community to push past politeness and actually check on them, they could have survived. The tuberculosis might have killed some of them anyway. Medicine was limited in 1916, but they wouldn't have suffered alone. Anne wouldn't have spent months living with corpses. The family's final months wouldn't have been characterized by desperate, deluded hope and ultimately pointless sacrifice. They should have made it, but comfort won over courage and silence won over truth, and everyone who could have helped found reasons not to. That's the real horror of this story, not ghosts or curses or supernatural evil, but ordinary human failings multiplied across an entire community until they became catastrophic. As I stood there in the ruins, I heard a sound that made my skin prickle, a child's voice singing. Just for a moment, barely audible, a girl singing a hymn with the words wrong. Jesus loves me when I'm good, when I'm quiet like I should. I spun around. No one there, just wind in the trees, creaking branches, the natural sounds of the forest. But for a moment, I'd heard it clearly, Anne's voice, or my imagination of it, or the land itself echoing with memory. I like to think it was Anne, finally speaking, finally refusing to be silent. The town had refused to say what happened to her family, but she was saying it herself, in the only way she knew how. A child's song, the words wrong, the tune carrying across decades. I was good, I was quiet, I helped Mama sleep. But Mama never woke up, and neither did I. That's what the town refused to say about the Ward family. That's the story they erased from their history, the guilt they buried under silence and denial and convenient forgetting. But I've said it now. I've broken the silence, and maybe that matters, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe telling the story changes something, or maybe it's just old man shouting into the void. But Anne Ward deserves to have her story told. Her family deserves to be remembered as people, not ghosts. And the town deserves to have its failure acknowledged, not to shame them, but to learn from them. Because this could happen anywhere. It probably is happening somewhere, right now. A family struggling in isolation, too proud or too afraid to ask for help. A community noticing something's wrong but choosing not to intrude. A child suffering in silence, taught to be good, to be quiet, to wait for things to get better. And if we forget the Wards, if we let their story disappear into comfortable silence, then we're complicit in the next tragedy. We're choosing comfort over courage, just like the people of Cutter's Gap did in 1916. So remember them. Remember Marcus and Loretta, and Samuel, and Mary, and Thomas, and especially Anne. Remember what happened when good intentions and bad circumstances and community cowardice combined. Remember, and do better. That's all we can do. Remember, and do better. And maybe, if we do, the singing in the woods will finally stop.